Thank you very much for the invitation and good morning to everybody. I'm going to do a presentation that focuses very specifically on one specific aspect of pension systems, namely the transition from work to retirement. And I think at some point I feel like I will come to very similar conclusions as Anna did in terms of how to get the right policy mix and maybe not only to think about pension systems in that sense. So my presentation is entitled From Early Exit to Active Aging, Do Employability Policies Promote an Increase in Social Inequalities in Later Life? And this is an outline of what I'm going to go through with you within the next 30 minutes or so. First of all, I will give you an overview why it is important to look at the transition from work to retirement and the underlying retirement decisions at the present time. And I will argue that the institutional context of retirement has changed. You will be aware of that as being pension experts. However, I will draw a very stylized picture of how this context has changed. I will give an overview looking at some institutional shifts, so using stylized data, for example, also from the OECD, to delineate this shift. So in a sense, I will operate on a macro level, showing you a very broad overview of basically institutional changes in modern Western societies. And then I will go down from the macro level to the micro level and try to make a comparison how basically these institutional changes have affected the retirement behavior individually from a comparative perspective. And I'm going to pick 4 countries, Austria, Germany, Sweden, and Estonia, who are very different countries in terms of how the labor force participation of older workers and how the retirement transition has developed. And I will not only look at when do people retire, but also why do people retire and why do people not retire? Why do they continue working? And I'm going to finish with some conclusions and some kind of a policy outlook on what one could learn from these comparisons I will do within my presentation. So starting with the first part, basically why is it important to look at the development of retirement? Well, my argument will be that we can, in a very stylized sense, differentiate 2 periods of retirement within the last 30, 40 years or so. The first period, starting in the 1970s, but going also up to 1995, is a period where most European countries have been characterized by a long-term trend towards early retirement. And this is in a way depicted here in this diagram. You can see this is the employment rate of men aged 60 to 64. I'm picking men here because using men the trends are much easier to illustrate. As we have seen in your presentation, the employment rate of women has increased very much in the last decades, and if I would be showing basically the participation rates of women, we would have 2 trends that overlap: an increasing participation rate, a declining rate of employment in old age, and it will be very difficult actually to disentangle what's going on. Thus, I'm looking here for, in a sense, didactic reasons at the employment rate for men, but I'm not ignoring women, of course, in that sense. As you can see, and here are a number of countries which can be regarded as a typical welfare state examples: Germany, Southern European country, Italy, Sweden, Scandinavian welfare state, United States as a typical liberal case, Czech Republic as an Eastern European country. However, what you can see here is basically that if we look at this employment rate of men aged 60 to 64 from the 1970s up to the mid-1990s, in almost all of the countries, we can see a substantial decline, most substantially in the country I'm coming from, in Germany actually, where it has more than halved during this period, but also a decline, even though occasionally at a much higher aggregate level in other countries such as Sweden and the United States. This trend of early retirement has been often considered as a response of these countries to rising unemployment and competition on worldwide markets in the 1970s. One thing that is often mentioned in this respect is the oil crisis in the 1970s, which steered mass unemployment, and early retirement was considered to be a labor market solution basically to this problem. However, this initial starting point basically just initiated the early retirement trend, that it continued throughout the following 2 decades, even though the initial cause was no longer present. So it turned into a permanent phenomenon, and this fact that it turned into a permanent phenomenon also led to the emergence of a so-called early retirement culture, so that basically retirement was increasingly considered to happen early in a normal sense, so that there's a kind of a social right or a normal way of going on to retirement way before the formal retirement age. So that's a basic trend in the 1970s to the 1990s, of course, with cross-national differences, as you can see. From the mid-1990s, 1995, up until today, we can see that this trend has changed. Again, I picked the same countries, employment rate men, age 60 to 64, and you can see that from 1995 to 2011, which is the latest point here, but we could also continue it to 2015, trend will largely be the same. Employment rates of individuals in the pre-retirement phase of 60 to 64 have risen again, most pronouncedly again in Germany, the country which dropped most, also increases most now, and by the year 2011, at least some of the countries are already at their almost initial starting point in the 1970s. The background basically for this reversal of this trend has been basically the consideration politically that early retirement was considered financially unsustainable against the background of demographic aging. Political measures, both at the national level but also at the European level, were introduced to reverse the early retirement trend. These included pension reforms. I will go through these kind of pension reforms a bit more in detail later on, but this idea of active aging was not restricted to pension reforms, but it also included employability policies that were interested in increasing basically the labor market chances of older workers on the changing labor market. And for example, lifelong learning has been one of these policies that has been fostered as part of the so-called active aging policy. And we can see as this active aging policy has progressed, employment rates of older workers have risen since the mid-1990s. Now, this is a very general background, so we have an institutional shift that is in a way accompanied by a labor market shift, and my questions today will be 2. First of all, I will look on international macro level and ask the question, what are the institutional preconditions for this successful reversal of the early exit trends? Is it only pension policies, or are they accompanied by policies in other fields? And the second question will then be going down to the micro level, so apply a within country perspective to look at how are different groups of older employees affected by active aging policies, so not only looking at the aggregate level, but looking at differences within countries. And the guiding question here, which you could also spot from the title of my presentation, is there an increase in social inequalities, and what could be done about it? So both parts refer back to a research project which I just finished the last year together with my colleagues Stephanie König and Moritz Hess, to which a lot of the acknowledgements for the forthcoming analyses go. This has been a project that has been funded by the German Science Foundation. However, it was not a project that remained restricted to Germany as a country, but where we collaborated with experts from 12 countries in Europe, Japan and the US, and part of the results will also include these countries in the following. This is our network, just to give you a short overview. So we have a number of European countries. Unfortunately, we did not have Finland in our project, so I cannot give you results for our analyses for Finland, actually, but I will be very happy to discuss what the results might mean for Finland. We got Sweden, as you can see, as a Scandinavian welfare state, plus the US, plus Japan as well. So these are the countries, and these are basically then our collaboration partners with whom we work together, not only to do analyses for 12 countries, but also have national experts which can tell us a bit more what these analyses actually mean in substance, and which have a better understanding of pension systems, labor market policies, social policies than a single individual from one country could ever have. So this is the approach we have taken, and I'm going to start now with the institutional perspective. So what are the preconditions for a successful reversal of the early exit trend? Now, to put it in a nutshell, the discussion about how to influence employment rates of older workers, both in terms of promoting early retirement, but also in terms of actually reversing the early retirement trend, has identified 3 different types of explanatory factors that can be considered. And I'm going to move along these 3 explanatory factors in the following presentation, actually. These explanatory factors are pull factors, push factors, and retention factors. Well, what do these mean? Pull factors actually mean that older workers, when they decide about whether to work or retire, are in a literal sense really pulled out of employment by financial incentives that are built into retirement systems that provide incentives to exit early from employment and during the early retirement phase, basically to exit way below reaching the formal retirement age. So these could be pre-pension systems. This could also be so-called welfare state subsystems, such as unemployment insurance or validity insurance, that provide benefits that make early retirement financially attractive. So they are, in a sense, pulled out of the labor market by these financial incentives. Push factors is a kind of an approach that has been forwarded very much by sociological labor market research. And the idea is here that it might not only be basically a decision based on financial incentives to leave the labor market, but leaving the labor market might also be a result of being crowded out from the labor market. So older workers are literally pushed out of employment due to, for example, unfavorable economic conditions, due to a high risk of unemployment, due to the lack of skills, high wage cost, for example, which make the employment of older workers less attractive, and which then provides incentives for older workers to leave the labor market prematurely because they are pushed out of the labor market. These have been the classical explanations of the early retirement trend in the 1970s up to the mid-1990s, and when this reversal of the early retirement trend set in, this was often also the explanation to this reversal, that people said, like, pull factors have been reduced, pension incentives have been abolished, and we have made the labor market more friendly for older workers in a sense, so that there's also less crowding out of older workers from employment. The argument which we have employed within our research project is basically that this is not the full story, but that we also have to look at stay factors or retention factors, so policies that are not just the reversal of early exit policies, but that are policy factors by themselves that work towards the maintenance of older workers in employment, for example, through lifelong learning, through investments into employability, through, for example, offering jobs to older workers. So actually explicit policies that work towards improving the employment chances of older workers. And in the following slides, I will go through all of these 3 factors and give you some very stylized overviews of how basically these pull factors, push factors, and retention factors have developed across European countries and the US. So we start basically with the pull factors, pension incentives to leave the labor market early, and I'm applying here a very, very easy approach to look at that, which is possibly not complex enough, of course, to cover what has been happening within pension systems, but maybe this stylized focus at least gives you an idea of the general trend. These are the changes in formal pension ages for a number of selected countries, comparing the year 1993 with the year 2010. Left side men, right side women. These are the normal retirement ages, and these arrows in green, black, and red indicate basically how the trend has developed. If the arrow is green, we see an increase in the normal retirement age. Black, we see constant trend within this 2-decade time span. And red, we see basically a decrease in the normal retirement age. And what you can spot already without going into much detail actually in the single changes is that most countries have actually promoted later retirement through an increase in the normal pensionable age. These increases have been particularly pronounced in a number of countries for women, in a sense to make the retirement patterns of men and women more similar, to actually equalize the retirement ages between men and women. So there's a general trend towards higher retirement ages. If one look at this development in more detail, one could see that these increases in the normal retirement age were often accompanied by simultaneous closing of early retirement options. So by both raising the normal retirement age and closing these early exit routes, retirement was made less attractive in most of the countries we are looking at here. Nonetheless, we see even by the year 2010 still quite considerable differences in the countries, with particularly some Southern European and Eastern European countries still displaying comparatively low retirement ages, at least as set by the normal pension limit. So that's the basic trend in pull factors. Push factors, crowding out of older workers. This is a long-term unemployment rate, which is meant to give a stylized overview, basically what has happened to the labor market situation of older workers. You can see we have grouped here a number of countries basically by the normal clustering across welfare regimes, welfare systems, and we have plotted here what is the percentage of long-term unemployment, meaning unemployment of more than a year, as a relative proportion of unemployment as a whole for this age group 55 plus. And again, without going into the details, you can see that in a number of countries, in fact, these push factors have also declined slightly. So the values for 2010, the grayish bars, are often slightly lower than the black bars, but you can also see that there are vast differences between the countries in these push factors, like in Southern European countries, in continental European countries such as Germany and the Netherlands. Long-term unemployment still is a very persistent problem within the labor market, while it is clearly less so in the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden, where we can also see a decrease in that period, and which is also clearly less so in the more flexible labor markets of the UK, US, and Japan. So again, these are also often the countries that have promoted then a longer employment of older workers simply by reducing the labor market obstacles to their employment. And finally, retention factors, so the factors that keep older workers within employment. And here I'm using basically from Eurostat a standard measure of participation of older workers, here measured as being aged 55 to 75, and their participation in formal and non-formal education and training. You might interpret that as a measure of lifelong learning among this age group, and again comparing values from 2004 up to 2014. And you can see basically again large differences between countries, a number of countries, continental countries, Eastern European countries, Southern European countries, with very low percentages of older workers in these age groups participating in this training and learning schemes, particularly Scandinavian countries like, for example, Denmark and Sweden, displaying high proportions, reflecting the high importance of lifelong learning in these countries, and similarly high rates also for the liberal countries here, included, for example, by the United Kingdom. Here it is less publicly fostered training of older workers that actually renews their qualifications, but rather the general logic of learning and training on the job that actually makes it possible for older workers to update their qualifications, while this is clearly less so the case for a number of continental and southern European countries. So again, cross-national differences in retention factors. We now combined basically the three dimensions into one index measure, which intends to measure basically this influence of institutional background, and this index measure in the end goes from 0 to a value of 14, where 0 basically is a value which shows the least support for older workers' employment across these three dimensions, and the maximum value of 14 then is a maximum support in a sense. So the higher the value, the higher the support for the employment of older workers. And we plotted that here against actual employment rates age 60 to 64 across a number of countries. And what you can see here, if you compare institutional support and actual employment rates, is that there is a clearly positive relationship between the two, meaning that apparently it is institutional background that also has a substantial influence on the employment rates of older workers within this age group. This does not only hold for present employment rates of older workers, what I just showed you, but also for future retirement expectations. So we have taken an indicator from the European Social Survey here, asking at what age would you like to retire. So this is people who are currently in work who are being asked, well, in the future, when would you like to retire? And you can see here basically that again, the relationship between this index measure which we developed and the envisioned retirement age at which time individuals would like to retire is also clearly positive, and the relationship is even stronger than we have seen it for actual employment rates. So in a sense, this institutional support does not only leave its traces in the employment rates of older workers, but also in the future employment and retirement expectations of older workers. So in a sense, also a strong argument for the salience of institutions in that respect. 5 minutes. Okay, then I have to be very quick with the micro results for 4 countries. The question here is now basically how are different groups of older employees affected by active aging, and is there an increase in social inequalities? Now we are comparing 4 countries here: Austria, Germany, Sweden, and Estonia. These are 4 polar cases actually for older workers' employment, and these are reflected here in the employment rates of older workers in 2000 and 2014. Austria is a case of a persistent early retirement country, and if one looks at the 3 institutional patterns which I've shown you earlier, pull, push, and basically maintenance incentives, Austria is characterized by a very generous pension system with still many retirement options and an early retirement age, a still rigid labor market, high seniority rights of older workers, very limited job opportunities, and very little investment into older workers' employability. So still a policy that is very much oriented on this old early exit paradigm. Now what we have looked at here now for this country and the forthcoming countries has been basically the reasons for retirement, for those who retire, and for those who continue working, the reasons for continued work. We always compare men and women in these diagrams, and we always compare different educational levels, low, middle, and high educational level, using this classical ISCAT classification that is in many surveys. And these data are all from the European Labour Force Survey 2012. And in this first graph, you see basically the reasons for retirement. You can see that in Austria, the main reason for retirement, given this low retirement age, is reaching the eligibility for a pension. Second most named reason, own health or disability, and these are the basic 2 reasons. The third reason that has been mentioned is as a clearly lower level, favorable financial arrangements to leave. So in a sense, in this early retirement country, many people retire because they reach their eligibility for a pension. This is mostly so for those with higher educational degrees, those who can more easily afford to continue working, and you see the opposite trend for own health or disability. This is something that actually affects rather those with lower educational levels and less so those with higher educational levels, with not so pronounced differences between men and women here. Reasons for work beyond retirement. Well, basically we compared 2 groups of reasons here, financial reasons and non-financial reasons. Financial reasons meaning really the need for continued work, and non-financial reasons basically rather intrinsic motivations to continue working, and maybe not the need for further investments into pensions, but really wanting to have a higher pension later on. And you can clearly see that most of the reasons here in Austria are rather voluntary reasons, particularly so among the higher educated. They work beyond retirement age because they want to work beyond retirement age, not because they financially need it. That is a basic pattern, and I'll be a bit more quick for the other countries so that we can see what's happening here. This is Germany. Germany, as we have seen earlier, a country that has reversed the early retirement trend, which you can see here, rising retirement age, closing of early exit routes. However, still a rigid labor market with high seniority protection and above all, only modest changes in employability policies. Particularly lifelong learning in Germany is still comparatively underdeveloped. What does this mean for the reasons for retirement? To put it very shortly, the picture is very similar as compared to the Austrian case, just that the first two reasons for retirement are flipped around. So basically the lower educated have to leave the labor market because of own health or disability, reaching eligibility for a pension, giving the higher retirement age, mostly applies to the higher educated, but to a clearly lower level than in Austria. So in a sense, a bit more unfavorable design for retirement transitions than in Austria, and a clearly less favorable design in the considerations why you work beyond retirement age, which are mostly involuntary here. So particularly the lower educated, as you can see here, mentioned the reason that they need to continue working under the changed retirement conditions for financial reasons, while this is clearly less so for basically the higher educated. So clear social inequalities. How about Sweden, Scandinavian welfare regime? We can easily go through these institutional factors, high retirement age with flexible retirement options, more flexible labor market, active labor market policies, high investments into particularly lifelong learning. And if we look here at the reasons for retirement and the reasons for work beyond retirement age, we see a completely different picture. We see no dominant reasons really in Sweden and no big differences with regards to educational background of the individuals. And this picture actually repeats if we look at the reasons for work beyond retirement age. Much more voluntary than in the German case and much less differentiation across educational levels here. So the more general, universal approach apparently also leads to a more flexible retirement pattern and a more equal retirement pattern across different social groups. And finally, closing out with Estonia, in my view, the most exciting example here, in a very negative sense, unfortunately. Early retirement age is still very much developed. There still are early exit schemes, but the replacement rate is very, very low. It's around 20 or 30% of the already low wages in this country. A flexible labor market, so basically where individuals can remain employed, and however, little support, as we have seen as in many Eastern European countries, for lifelong learning. And basically the only reason to continue working is actually basically that you have no pension deductions and a very low replacement rate that might motivate you to continue working. What does this mean for the reasons for retirement? Completely different than the other countries. The main reason is having lost a job, so a completely involuntary push out of the labor market. In other countries, you much more likely reach the normal retirement age. Here you are pushed out either because of losing your job or suffering from health or disability, so that you have to take this route. Reaching eligibility age, which was a much more dominant pattern in other countries, is a minority phenomenon here, accounting for only 10 to 20% of retirement transitions. And the picture gets even more black, not only in a color sense here, if we look at men and women and their reasons to retire. While we saw that this was very much split across groups in the previous countries, we can see irrespective of gender, irrespective of the educational background, working beyond retirement age is a forced phenomenon here purely for financial reasons, and only very, very few people, even among the higher educated, continue working beyond retirement age. I'm coming to the conclusion slides, and I'm going to go very quick through these. Well, basically, one can argue that there has been a policy reorientation from early retirement to active aging, as I've shown in the first part. We are moving towards an increased employment of older people in European countries. However, there are cross-national differences, and the most successful cases in reversing this trend have been those countries that have followed an integrated approach, such as here Sweden, of reducing pull and push factors while also promoting employability. At the same time, however, this rising tide of later retirement doesn't appear to basically lift all boats in a sense. Especially lower educated or unskilled workers are faced with a dual challenge to continue working for financial reasons and basically we have seen that this is mostly so in countries like Estonia, which have applied a one-sided focus basically on just reducing pension incentives to exit early without promoting further employment for older workers, while policy reforms that really take the active aging paradigm seriously in that sense that they combine pension reforms with the reduction of labor market barriers, but also the promotion of employability policies, particularly fostering lifelong learning among the older population, not only increase the labor market participation of older workers in the aggregate, but also lead to the fact that this general shift comes along with lower social inequalities. So I hope that was still followable on the last slides. I had to be a bit quick because of timing, but I'm looking very much forward to discussing these results with you later on. Thank you very much.